London, 1891. The city's fog-covered streets were alive with the hum of horse-drawn carriages, the glow of gas lamps, and the whispers of a population already haunted by recent memories of Jack the Ripper. But while the Ripper had faded into myth, another darkness was about to emerge, one that would chill even the most hardened souls of Victorian England. Picture this, a narrow alley in Whitechapel, the kind where brick walls seem to close in, where shadows stretch unnaturally long. A woman's body is discovered, laid out with surgical precision, as if the killer had been less interested in murder and more in dissection. The cuts are clean. Too clean, not the work of a frenzied madman, but someone practiced, deliberate, controlled. It was 1891, and London was once again staring into the abyss of its own nightmares. A pattern was taking shape. Victims chosen with eerie selectivity. Lives ended with unnerving calm. Bodies treated as experiments rather than as human beings. And what made this case especially terrifying was the chilling contradiction. The man soon to be known as the gentleman butcher did not lurk in shadows as a derelict or thug. By daylight, he was refined, charming, and impeccably dressed. He dined in respectable clubs, spoke of art and literature, and carried the aura of a man above suspicion. But by night, he revealed the monster beneath the mask. And this leads us to the most unsettling question. What turns a human being into a monster in a gentleman's suit? The story begins with a woman named Clara Watson, a 24-year-old seamstress living in the East End. Clara was hard-working, known for her warm laughter, and carried herself with the resilience born from hardship. Like many women of her station, she balanced precariously on the edge of poverty, moving between sewing work for factories and taking commissions from wealthier households who needed mending. On January 17, 1891, Clara finished her shift later than usual. Witnesses last recalled seeing her walking along Hanbury Street, her shawl pulled tightly against the winter wind. She spoke briefly with a fellow worker before vanishing into the night. The next morning, her body was found behind a butcher's shop. Her remains disturbingly staged, as if the killer wanted the world to see his work. But Clara was not just a victim. She was the spark that lit the fuse of public terror. Londoners realized this killing was no ordinary street crime. The precision was too exact, the cruelty too calculated. Someone had chosen her carefully, and someone had carried out this crime with chilling expertise. Clara's disappearance and death led investigators to question her immediate circle. She had a small but close group of friends, most from her sewing workshop. She was occasionally seen in the company of a man described as well-dressed, with polished shoes and a soft voice. Witnesses remembered his politeness, his gestures of paying for Clara's meals, his apparent refinement. To Clara's friends, this was surprising. Men of that stature rarely showed interest in women of her class. Some whispered it might lead to marriage. Others felt an unease they could not name. The man gave no name, and Clara referred to him only as the gentleman. It would soon become clear that this relationship was not romantic chance, but deliberate. Hunting. The investigation revealed reports of a figure seen loitering in Whitechapel weeks before Clara's death, always well-dressed, always carrying a leather case, the kind physicians used. Witnesses noted how he seemed to study passers-by, not with casual interest, but with the detached focus of someone examining specimens. He often appeared near butcher shops, staring too long at carcasses in the window, his expression unreadable. Some shop owners remembered him asking detailed questions about cuts of meat, not in the way of a customer, but more like a critic assessing technique. One chilling detail emerged. A local child claimed to have seen this gentleman sharpening knives by the light of a street lamp, humming softly as if preparing for some performance. Most dismissed it as childish imagination, but in hindsight, it became a haunting clue. Clara's murder scene was nothing short of grotesque. Her body had been laid out on a wooden board, almost like a butcher's display. The cuts were deliberate, organs removed with knowledge of anatomy, wounds stitched with near medical skill. There was no sign of struggle, suggesting she had been subdued quickly, perhaps even drugged. The killer left no fingerprints, no obvious trace, only a mocking signature, Clara's necklace placed neatly by her side, as though to taunt investigators with a reminder of who she was before he erased her humanity. For Londoners, The horror was not only in the act itself, but in its eerie artistry. This was no random act of violence. It was a ritual, a statement, an exhibition of control. The Metropolitan Police, still reeling from the unsolved Ripper case, mobilized quickly. Chief Inspector Frederick Aberline, who had investigated Jack the Ripper, was reluctantly brought back to consult. He noted at once the differences. Where the Ripper was frenzied and chaotic, this killer was methodical, professional. Doctors who examined Clara's body concluded that the killer had formal training in anatomy, perhaps even surgery. This narrowed the suspect pool to a chilling degree. The murderer was not an anonymous figure of the night. He was likely a man of education, perhaps even prestige. Rumors spread like wildfire. Was the gentleman butcher a doctor? A surgeon, a butcher with delusions of artistry? Or worse, someone who mingled freely among the city's elite, unnoticed? Though Clara's death seemed isolated at first, within weeks, another body appeared. This time a young woman named Margaret Hughes. The same surgical precision, the same eerie display, the same absence of struggle. Patterns were forming, and investigators realized this was not the act of a single crime. This was a serial killer with a plan, one who viewed London itself as his hunting ground. Early speculation suggested sexual motives. But doctors noted something different. There was no evidence of assault. The killer's focus was on control, anatomy, and display. It was as if he sought to demonstrate his mastery over life and death, reducing human beings to objects of craft. For the first time, newspapers began using the phrase, "the gentleman butcher." It was not only his crimes, but his demeanor that unsettled London. A killer who behaved like a refined scholar by day, only to become something else entirely by night. Clara's mother, a widowed laundress, collapsed when she identified her daughter's remains. In her grief, she spoke words that echoed through London's press. "He took my child and carved her like meat." What kind of man calls himself a gentleman and does this? Her anguish struck a chord with the working-class families of Whitechapel, who lived in constant fear that their daughters might be next. Each night, doors were bolted earlier, windows shuttered tighter, and streets emptied before sundown. By the end of February 1891, London stood at the edge of hysteria. 2 women dead, both displayed with surgical cruelty. A killer who hid in plain sight. Investigators faced not only a murderer, but a psychological enigma. A man who blended civility with savagery, refinement with brutality. The gentleman butcher was no myth, no phantom. He was real, and as the body count threatened to rise, the city braced itself for horrors yet to come. March 1891 brought no relief. The city's dread hardened into routine anxiety. Mothers counting daughters' footsteps, shopkeepers scanning every well-dressed passerby. Within weeks, 2 more women were taken, both found with the same cold exactitude. One was Eleanor Price, a domestic servant whose body had been arranged on a baker's board. The other, Rose Alden, a milliner whose remains were placed deliberately inside an empty meat locker. Each scene repeated the killer's hallmarks: precise incisions, removal of certain tissues, no apparent sexual assault, and a silent, clinical contempt for the victim's personhood. Pattern recognition became the investigators' only lifeline. The killer selected vulnerable women who moved between households and workshops, women whose disappearances might not arouse immediate notice. He used substances to render them immobile before executing his procedures. He left displays that read like signatures, an anatomical arrangement, a removed token, a careful placement that suggested both ego and ritual. At the 3rd scene, a small but decisive clue was found, a fragment of dark braided suture lodged near a wound. The hospital surgeons called it unusual, braided silk imported from Lyons, not the coarse threads local butchers used. A second discovery amplified its significance. In the lining of a discarded handkerchief near the 4th scene, faint traces of chloroform were detected by a physician willing to test. Chloroform in 1891 was not a common handkerchief scent. It signaled medical knowledge and access to anesthetic supplies. These details altered the investigative map. The suspect was unlikely to be a common butcher. He was someone trained or apprenticed, someone with access to surgical materials, an understanding of anatomy, and the means to obtain imported sutures. Theories coalesced: a surgeon, a dentist, a student of medicine, or a man who had worked in a dissecting room. Newspaper pages swelled with blame. The press hunted for monsters in respectable circles. A local butcher, Samuel Pike, was publicly accused after a witness said she saw a man matching his description near Rose Alden's workplace. Pike was seized by a mob and held until police intervened. He had no surgical training, no chloroform, and a rock-solid alibi. He was released within days, but not before the damage was done. His shop's windows were smashed. His family fled Whitechapel. A surgeon from a nearby infirmary, Dr. Samuel Pratt, came under suspicion after a disgruntled patient recalled a heated argument the doctor had with a woman resembling Eleanor. Pratt's reputation suffered. He was interrogated, his instruments inspected. Nothing linked him conclusively to the crimes. Each false lead chewed at investigators' credibility and made the public thirst for arrest more ravenous. Faced with a sophisticated killer, the Metropolitan Police and consulted physicians began to build a behavioral portrait. This was not a madman in a gutter. This was a man who wore civility like armor and used precision as his language. The profile emphasized three core elements. Professional competence. The killer exhibited surgical dexterity, clean incisions, careful removal of organs or tissue, and an apparent familiarity with human anatomy that exceeded ordinary cruelty. Compartmentalization. By day he belonged to polite society. He could discuss art, dine with clients, purchase imported medical supplies without arousing suspicion. By night he entered the role of anatomist and executioner. Control and exhibitionism. The staging of victims, displayed as specimens, indicated a desire not only to kill, but to prove mastery. The killer required witnesses, even if those witnesses were discovery and the post-mortem gaze. Investigators asked what could create such a mind. Childhood isolation, early exposure to dissection, social double lives, humiliation masked by refinement, all were plausible. At this stage, the profile remained speculative but disciplined. It guided investigations away from thuggish streets and toward lecture halls, medical supply shops, and genteel clubs. Chief Inspector Frederick Aberline remained involved. His experience with the Ripper case made him cautious and haunted. He shared the task with Inspector James Cairns, a methodical man who kept meticulous notebooks. Cairns slept poorly, haunted by the knowledge that every missed connection could mean another life. Detectives worked in shifts, interviewing shopkeepers, trawling registries of medical apprentices, and poring over hospital order books. The work took a human toll. One constable, who had seen too many bodies, began to drink. Another detective's wife left, afraid of sharing a bed with a man whose job invited darkness. The case consumed men who were not merely solving a crime. They were trying to map a mind that refused to conform to known categories. Each failure seared into them. Detectives expanded door-to-door inquiries into the supply chains for surgical instruments and imported suture. They checked the ledgers of City Medical Supplies, a small firm near Holborn with discreet clients in both hospital and household circles. A clerk remembered a purchase of braided silk thread and a set of fine scalpels sold to a man who gave his name as E. Hawthorne, a name that later would ripple through police reports. Hawthorne, as a ledger entry, was not enough to name a killer, but the purchase offered a lead, a rope to tug. Investigators also scrutinized the inventories of private surgeons and dental practices. They interviewed dissecting room attendants at medical schools about any student who lingered over anatomical specimens with atypical intensity. Several attendants mentioned a reserved man who spent extra hours reassembling cadavers with an unusual care. He spoke rarely, studied anatomy obsessively, and seemed more interested in the artistry of dissection than the science. The attendant's description matched the profile's portrait of a man for whom bodies were both medium and message. The victims' lives began to matter in public imagination, reframing statistics into humanity. Clara's and Eleanor's neighborhoods erected small shrines. Roses, worn shawls, and prayer cards accumulated on sills. Letters surfaced, postmarked notes where victims asked for extra work, where a mother fretted over wages due, showing how ordinary and precious these women were. They were not faceless bodies. They were daughters, sisters, earners, and caretakers. Their families spoke of small details that made the victims whole. Clara's careful mending, Eleanor's gift for baking, Rose's habit of humming as she worked. The narrative shifted from sensational pattern to personal catastrophe. The killer's theater of control now felt obscene against the background of everyday devotion. Newspapers capitalized on terror. Sensational headlines outpaced careful reporting. Rival publications invented nicknames. Gentleman Butcher took hold because it sold more papers than any other phrase. Editorials demanded swift justice. Letters to the editor accused the police of incompetence. Crowds gathered when patrols placed posters of victims. Volunteers formed night watches. The social order buckled in small ways. Doctors canceled house calls in certain districts. Some respectable clubs quietly tightened guest lists. This climate created two problems for the investigation. First, the killer read the papers. He knew the vocabulary the public used to name him. Second, false confessions and tip-offs multiplied, overwhelming detectives with noise. Each credible lead was buried in dozens of worthless claims. In April, a pattern that initially seemed intangible took physical form. An elderly woman, cleaning a room for a recently widowed lodger, found an unsigned notebook tucked under floorboards. Inside were meticulous sketches of anatomical sections, drawings of muscle fibers, notes on incision angles, and lists of surgical instruments. Some pages contained strange annotations, times, streets, and what looked like shorthand for names. The notebook was not conclusive proof. It could belong to a student of anatomy, a medical teacher, or a collector. But the handwriting style matched the handwriting on the invoice for the lion silk braid purchased from City Medical Supplies, both written in a neat, practiced hand. The ledger clerk who had recorded the sale was brought in. He confirmed, under pressure, that the handwriting was similar to the man who signed as E. Hawthorne. Detectives now had two threads converging: material purchases and a private record of anatomical obsession. The map of their hunt tightened. The notion that the killer moved freely within respectable circles no longer felt theoretical. It felt imminent. By late April 1891, the city's dread had an address in investigators' notebooks, but not yet in the dock. The Metropolitan Police had narrowed their focus to educated men with access to surgical supplies and a taste for secrecy. They had a suspect name in an invoice, a notebook that whispered of obsession and corroborating forensic clues, braided silk and chloroform, that refused to be ignored. But the killer remained at large. Whitechapel's nights stayed uneasy. Men in tailored coats walked with new suspicion. Detectives slept in their coats and rose with the resolve of men who knew the hour of capture might arrive at any moment, or slip through their fingers forever. The hunt had moved from terror into method. The narrative had shifted from random horror to a man shaped by practice and habit. The next step would require courage, patience, and one more leap, linking the signature in the notebook to a living, breathing gentleman who owned both a reputation and the darkest of secrets. The hunt narrowed until it felt impossibly intimate. What had been a constellation of clues, braided silk, chloroform, a ledger entry, began to form a portrait with edges sharp enough to cut. By May 1891, detectives were no longer chasing a phantom. They had a name on a paper, an image in the margins, and a route that led into the heart of genteel London. The ledger entry, E. Hawthorne, had been a thin rope. It became a cable when the handwriting on the invoice matched handwriting in the notebook found beneath the floorboards. A local calligrapher compared loops and pressure points. The way the cross on the T's leaned left, the small, precise curl on lowercase g's. It was the sort of technical match that made seasoned detectives hold their breath. The clerk who had sold the braided silk remembered the purchaser's voice too, soft, measured, the sort of cultivated accent that suggested education and assurance, not the rough tones of a common tradesman. Detectives dug into public records. Edward Hawthorne, if that was the full name behind the ledger, appeared in directories as Edmund Hawthorne, MRCS, a member of a surgical society, a lecturer by some accounts. He lived in a terraced house in Bloomsbury, kept a small private practice, attended charity evenings, and sat on committees that advised working-class women on health. He taught anatomy lessons to apprentices. He was, by all outward appearances, a pillar of late Victorian respectability. It was the type of camouflage investigators feared most: access and acceptance. Hawthorne's work gave him keys, dissecting rooms, chemical supplies, and the anonymity of professional respect. His affability offered plausible explanations for why a woman might accept his company. He had motive in the mind of the profile, not in the legal sense, but in the psychological sense. He fit the outline: competent, compartmentalized, controlled. Detectives placed Hawthorne under quiet surveillance. They observed him at lectures, noted his polite conversations with students, his proprietary interest in surgical texts. They watched him attend a charity soiree where working women came seeking counsel. Several witnesses later reported he lingered near the edge of the room, speaking discreetly to seamstresses and servants, offering small kindnesses that, in hindsight, read like reconnaissance. On an overcast Thursday, 2 plainclothes constables followed Hawthorne as he left the lecture hall and moved through a lane lined with butcher shops. He paused, peered into a shop window, and adjusted his gloves, small, exacting gestures that a surgeon might make to steady his hands. Detectives took that time to approach. Hawthorne greeted the intrusiveness with disarming politeness, produced professional papers, and offered a ready alibi. He had lectured at the hospital that evening and had receipts proving his attendance. It was an awkward near miss. Without a warrant, they could do little. What changed the calculus was the notebook. Forensic scrutiny turned the notebook from curiosity to evidence. Pages contained anatomical sketches, renderings more precise than the average student's. Notes listed times paired with street names. Marginalia recorded suture angle 12 and preferred vein, left radial, alongside what looked like shorthand initials. Cross-referencing those initials with missing persons reports revealed chilling coincidences. Clara Watson's initials appeared, CW, next to a date that matched her disappearance. Margaret Hughes's initials, MH, were there too. Under pressure, a former dissecting room attendant admitted to recognizing Hawthorne's handwriting from notes he once left on a cadaver table. His description of Hawthorne's behavior was damning. An obsessive who lingered alone with specimens, who argued for aesthetic reassembly of bodies because it evoked an artistic satisfaction in him. The attendant had once found Hawthorne taking meticulous measurements, as if rehearsing a procedure on a living canvas. Armed with this testimony, plus the chloroform residue found on a handkerchief near the 4th scene, and the lion's braid identified in Hawthorne's purchase, detectives secured a warrant and entered Hawthorne's home. What the warrant uncovered stripped illusions quickly. In a back room, behind a false panel, officers found a carefully arranged work table, scalpels, braided silk, notebooks, and anatomical diagrams neatly stacked. There were small glass vials labeled with dates, faint traces of organic matter sealed in jars, and, grotesquely, a set of small tokens: a button from a dress, a scrap of a shawl, the broken clasp of a necklace that matched the description of Clara Watson's missing jewelry. The room was clinical, organized, devotional. It read like a private laboratory and an altar combined. No blood was visibly present. Hawthorne had been methodical in cleaning, but the residue tests, then rudimentary, matched organic tissue samples taken from the victim's postmortems. The presence of chloroform, the lion braid, and the victim tokens created a chain of physical evidence long enough to anchor an arrest. Hawthorne was taken into custody the same evening. He adjusted his coat, accepted the handcuffs with a quiet nod, and asked in the same soft cadence witnesses described if he might fetch his handkerchief. The composed facade unnerved officers. This was civility answering a rope. In custody, Hawthorne's public image and private obsessions seemed to fight for dominance. Neighbors were incredulous. A widow living 2 doors down insisted she had known Edmund Hawthorne for years. He had helped her write letters, he had donated money to the parish, and he often checked on the health of neighborhood children. Yet his house of respectability concealed a room cataloging horrors. Detectives watched him for cracks. He spoke calmly but evasively when interviewed. He maintained an air of rationalism, describing his studies in terms of scientific curiosity. He argued about technique in the detached voice of a scholar. The clinical language he used, excision, technique, specimen, struck at the hearts of the detectives who read the notebooks aloud, line by line. The first formal charges were framed not yet as a confession, but as the accumulation of evidence: possession of instruments and materials linked to mutilation, possession of victims' property, and suspicious activity correlating with the time and place of disappearances. The Crown would add more as pathologists convened to testify. Hawthorne's family was devastated. His wife, soft-spoken, socially active, collapsed in the police station's anteroom. Their teenage son insisted if his father had done anything, it must have been an error, a misinterpretation that would be cleared. Friends expressed disbelief publicly, then privately began to distance themselves. A charitable committee resigned en masse rather than be associated with scandal. The social scaffolding that had once concealed Hawthorne's nights began tearing under the daylight of inquiry. For the victims' families, the arrest offered a brittle, complicated relief. The knowledge that a man of status had preyed on their daughters both validated their fear and deepened their outrage. Clara's mother visited the station, touched the cuff of Hawthorne's coat as though to ensure the man in custody was the one who had taken her child. She wanted to see him looked in the face. She wanted the city to look back and see the failure that had allowed such a man to roam. Even as the city exhaled, investigators felt no triumph. For them, arrest was the end of a map but not of an ache. Aberline and Cairns sorted the evidence into categories: material, testimonial, psychological, and prepared for the trial. Each item in the case file was a paper witness. Each page of Hawthorne's notebooks forced them to reconstruct motive without simplifying it into a single word. Psychologists and doctors were called to consult. They offered early impressions, compartmentalization, ritualization, and a pursuit of aesthetic control. But they stopped short of full psychodiagnosis. These were not labels they threw lightly, and the medico-legal terrain of the time lacked the vocabulary modern clinicians might use. A twist that stunned both investigators and society emerged as they dug into Hawthorne's social life. He had cultivated ties with charitable organizations aimed at helping working women, groups that offered lessons in hygiene and sewing. In public, he lectured on the dignity of labor. In private, he used those platforms to identify and approach his victims. He had weaponized empathy. This was the most unsettling element. The killer's predation was not random opportunity. It was a calculated abuse of trust. He'd inserted himself into circuits women relied upon, and he'd used kindness as camouflage. That revelation altered public debate, not just on policing, but on the vulnerabilities woven into the social fabric. By late May, the investigation had sketched a plausible architecture of intent. Hawthorne's actions suggested a man who sought to assert control where he felt it most absent. Women who worked for others, who relied on errand work, who crossed boundaries of class, were both available and, in the warped calculus of the killer, pliable. He prepared chloroform to subdue, sutures to execute his work, and selected public displays to assert mastery. The tokens he kept were trophies. The notebooks were both manual and confession in code, yet questions remained. Why this specific ritual? Why the public display? Was it a need to humiliate, to paralyze witnesses with fear, or an exhibitionist assertion of skill? Each new piece of evidence deepened the psychological puzzle, rather than settling it. Edward Hawthorne sat in a cell while London argued about how a gentleman could have become a butcher of women. The police file had grown thick: ledger entries, matched handwriting, chloroform traces, victim tokens, and the private laboratory behind a false panel. He was charged and remanded for trial. Families felt a measure of closure in name, if not absolution. The city felt less preyed upon, but more betrayed. And yet the core questions remained, questions about motive, childhood, compulsion, and the anatomy of a mind that could live in polite society while committing atrocities. Those questions would follow Hawthorne into court and, if he told the truth, into the witness of his own past. Edward Hawthorne was a man of contrasts. Born to a minor clerical family in the provinces, he rose through scholarship and apprenticeship into the genteel class. He earned surgical credentials, MRCS, and cultivated a public persona of calm expertise. He married well enough to secure social standing. He taught anatomy. He lectured on public health. In print and in lectures, he spoke with authority about the dignity of the human body. But private records and witness testimony revealed a different track. As a boy, he had been solitary, vividly precocious, prone to cataloging insect specimens and sketching mussels rather than sharing the playground. A humiliating incident in adolescence, public ridicule over a youthful mistake in the dissecting room, left him unusually sensitive to shame. He learned to hide. He learned to perform civility with a precision that matched his scalpels. Doctors who studied Hawthorne's notebooks and his life described a constellation of traits rather than a tidy diagnosis. He displayed obsessive attention to detail. He ritualized tasks. He compartmentalized emotions and maintained social routines that masked private compulsions. Clinicians noted elements consistent with what Victorian experts called moral insanity, an erosion of feeling and restraint in which intellect remained intact while empathy atrophied. Modern language would add words like obsessional compulsion, narcissistic fixation on control, and eroticized mastery, though contemporaneous witnesses used softer phrases: cold, driven, unnerving. Crucially, Hawthorne's violence carried an aesthetic motive. He spoke of form and symmetry. To him, anatomy was both science and art. The victims were not merely targets. They were material for an exacting ritual. He preserved tokens. He took notes. He displayed his results like cataloged studies. That pattern made the crimes less about impulsive rage and more about a deliberate project, an artistic and tyrannical pursuit of control. The trial was the city's reckoning. Courtrooms swelled with pressmen, with kin of the victims, and with a public hungry for moral accounting. The prosecution presented a tightly sewn case: the lion's braided suture purchased under Hawthorne's ledger name, the handwriting match between invoice and the notebook found beneath the floorboards, the chloroform traces on cloth linked to tissue residues in medical jars from Hawthorne's hidden room, the physical tokens, shards of jewelry and fabric, matched to victims, and critically, witness testimony placing Hawthorne with several victims shortly before their disappearances. Pathologists took the stand and explained, in painstaking terms, the precision of the incisions, the knowledge required to detach tissue without obvious blood loss, and the likely use of an anesthetic to subdue victims. Dissecting room attendants testified about Hawthorne's lingering attentions to cadavers. His insistence on order, and a single attendant corroborated the handwriting match from the table notes Hawthorne had left while supervising an anatomical demonstration. The defense mounted two strategies. First, they sought to muddy the chain of evidence, arguing that common surgical supplies were widely available, that handwriting matches were subjective, and that memories were faulty. Second, they attempted an insanity plea. Hawthorne, they claimed, suffered a mental derangement that left him unable to control compulsions. They called a psychiatrist to attest to his oddities, but the expert stopped short of claiming full legal insanity. The jury listened to hours of dry testimony and the weight of corroboration. In a verdict that shocked some and comforted others, the jury found Hawthorne sane and guilty on multiple counts. The sentence, unequivocal for its time, was capital. The law would take him to the scaffold. So why did Edward Hawthorne become the gentleman butcher? The evidence collected throughout investigation and trial offers a layered answer rather than a single motive. First, there was a compulsion to control. Hawthorne's childhood shame and lifelong preoccupation with precision recalibrated into a hunger to master bodies that, in his moral imagination, had slighted the order he prized. In the dissecting room, he practiced on cadavers. In the street, he sought living canvases. Second, there was exhibitionism and symbolic assertion. He staged bodies. He left tokens. He kept notebooks. These acts were less to communicate with victims than to claim authorship, public markers of triumph over vulnerability. The displays functioned as a perverse signature, a way to convert secrecy into recognition without risking immediate detection. Third, he weaponized trust. Hawthorne's charity work was cover. It was recruitment. The veneer of public service gave him access to women who were socially exposed and economically dependent. He used kindness to lower defenses. In the warped logic of his pathology, benevolence became means to predation. Fourth, there was aestheticization of violence. Hawthorne framed anatomy as art. He pursued symmetry and clean procedures in ways that blurred clinical training and personal fantasy. This aesthetic drive made his acts ritualistic and repeatable. None of this excuses him. It explains only the architecture behind the crimes. A man whose intellect remained intact while his moral compass disintegrated into technique and obsession. The verdict did not heal. Families of the victims experienced complicated closure, relief that the man who haunted their nights had been named, and enduring grief that could not be legislated away. Clara Watson's mother refused to attend the execution. She said she did not want the image of his end to mirror the image of her child's beginning. Other families visited the prison chaplain, not for vengeance, but for an exhausted measure of peace. For investigators, the trial was a bitter triumph. Inspector James Cairns and Chief Inspector Aberline gained professional respect. They had followed threads through fog and falsehood, but their notebooks bore more than procedural success. Men who had read Hawthorne's marginalia and held fragments of victims' clothing carried new scars. One detective requested leave for mental health, what was then called nervous collapse. Another retired early, unable to reconcile a civilized life with the knowledge of how easily camouflage hid savagery. Whitechapel changed. Neighborhood watches remained. Charitable societies restructured their vetting. Medical schools tightened custody protocols for supplies. Society learned painfully that civility could be weaponized and that institutions meant to protect could be exploited. Edward Hawthorne was the who. He was convicted by material evidence and witness testimony that connected his ledger purchases, his handwriting, his chloroform access, and his hidden laboratory to the murders. He was the why, driven by obsession, the need for control, exhibition, and the perverse aestheticization of bodies. He was the how, by cultivating trust, deploying anesthetic, using surgical technique, and staging victims as specimens. In the dock, Hawthorne never offered grand confessions. He answered with measured statements that reeked of rationalism rather than remorse. The court's medical experts insisted he understood right from wrong. The jury agreed. The sentence was carried out under the law of the day. But legal closure does not erase the human cost. The city's fear softened into vigilant memory. Institutions adapted. Families carried the loss. The notebooks were archived as evidence and later used in lectures as cautionary exemplars about the misuse of scientific knowledge. Was this evil born or made? A single answer is too neat for a life that folded intellect into atrocity. The evidence suggests manufacture as much as inheritance, shame, obsession, opportunity, and social structures that allowed a gentleman to prey on the vulnerable. But there remains an abyss at the center of that explanation, a place where agency and compulsion touch. If you're listening now, think about the systems that leave people exposed. Think about the institutions that give power without accountability. Think about how civility can be a mask. If this story unsettled you, discuss it below. What line separates curiosity from cruelty? And how should society guard against men who weaponize trust? If you want more deep case studies like this, subscribe, like, and share. Help this channel investigate the shadows so fewer victims slip through.